Hey LFC, welcome to week 4 of our life group studies through the book of Amos. And it's really interesting. Amos, of course, being in the Old Testament, there's a lot of Christians who they might be slow to study the Old Testament because I hear a lot of people, not necessarily Christians, but a lot of people today will say and talk about how the God of the Old Testament was angry and vengeful and full of wrath, and the God of the New Testament is love and tolerance and grace. But what they fail to understand is that God didn't just become gracious and patient in the New Testament. He was actually very gracious and patient in the Old Testament. What we see is in Deuteronomy 28, as God is communicating the law to the nation of Israel as they're about to go into the promised land. He tells them in Deuteronomy 28 the blessings and the curses of what it looks like to walk in obedience or disobedience. He says to them very plainly and clearly, if you obey, you fulfill your part of the covenant, blessings are going to come. There's going to be peace in your land. You won't experience great sickness or famine or anything to that nature. But if you disobey, and then he gives a list of things that will happen. And it's a progressive list. God doesn't just immediately punish them with wrath. He says, look, if you begin to disobey, there'll be some sickness. Then you'll experience famine and locusts, and then wars will happen. And so he explains that as you begin to sin, there's going to be a progression of discipline in your life. And this discipline isn't cruel. This discipline is meant to get your attention, that you've wandered off the right track and you need to get back in line. But the greatest punishment, if that Israel fails to repent, eventually they're going to go into exile. And what we see is when we come to the book of Amos in chapter 4, this is not God's first attempt to get their attention. He's tried to get their attention through different punishments up to this point. In chapter 4, he says, I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities. We, in our day, we think clean teeth is a good thing. That means that you have good hygiene. But in Amos's day, the only way that you had clean teeth is when you didn't have anything to eat. There was a famine, and you had poverty, and people, the only way that you had dirty teeth is when you had a lot to eat. And he says, I took away your food. You had lack of bread in all your places. That's one of the warnings. And he says, I also withheld rain from you, where there were yet 3 months to the harvest. So again, he's fulfilling another warning. He's already fulfilled it. He stopped the rain. And so they had no drinking water. The crops weren't growing, so they didn't have food. And he says, yet you did not return to me. I struck you with blight and mildew. And he said, I sent among you a pestilence after the manner of Egypt. So just like the days that I cursed Egypt, I've already sent pestilence and plagues to you, and yet you failed to turn your attention to me. And he says, I killed your young men with sword. I allowed war to come into your land. Another warning. And we don't like to talk about discipline today, but the Bible has a lot to say about discipline. In fact, Proverbs mentions that if you were to fail to discipline your child, you could end up costing them their life later on. That discipline, godly discipline, leads to life. It leads to being fruitful and flourishing in what God has designed you to do and be. And we see in the New Testament as well that the writer of Hebrews says that God disciplines Christians today as sons to lead us into maturity. That, in fact, for God not to discipline is probably evidence that maybe you're not a legitimate son of God. And so tonight, it'd be real easy to talk about how in our day that discipline is an issue. That kids are the way they are in our day because parents fail to discipline. And I think there's some truth to that. But it's not just a problem that happens in our day. It was a problem that happened in Amos's day. I don't think a lack of discipline is a cultural issue. I think it's a human issue. That Israel failed to respond to God's discipline. And so our lesson tonight is really about this topic. How can we as Christians be sensitive to God's discipline in our life? He doesn't discipline us in the way he did Israel. It's different. It's unique. He disciplines us through the presence of his Spirit, through conviction, through an awareness of sin, through giving us and allowing us to have guilt over our sin. But again, a lot of Christians today, they avoid those things. How can we as believers be sensitive to God's work in our life, to allow God to discipline us in a way that we can grow and mature and be faithful? I hope you enjoyed tonight's study, and I look forward to seeing you next time.